Welcome to the wonderful world of archaeology. Let's go ahead and dive right in. In order to understand what archaeology is, we should first emphasize what archaeology is not. And I hate to break it to you, but archaeology is not the study of dinosaurs. That is paleontology. If you signed up to study dinosaurs, you're in the wrong place. I'm sorry to have to say this to you because I am a true fan of Jurassic Park. It's my favorite movie. And I did have an interest in dinosaurs myself as a kid, but that's not what we're going to be talking about in this course. Archaeology is also not what you see in the movies, even though I did grow up in love with Indiana Jones. And most importantly, archaeology is not the type of looting you might have seen or heard about or read about in various parts of the world. This is not an academic discipline. This is for pure profit or other, disreputable sorts of behaviors. So, what archaeology is, then, is the scientific study of past human societies through their material remains, or what we refer to more generally as the archaeological record. There are various types of archaeology. Those friends of ours to the north, up in Canada, practice archaeology every time there's a huge snowstorm. Ha ha ha. There is also the possibility of, historical archaeology in the future. Perhaps they'll be looking at the plethora of Mickey D's, McDonald's restaurants all across the world and scratching their head over that. Who knows? On a more serious note, some other types of archaeology include what we call paleoanthropology, and this is the study of very early humans. There's also classical archaeology, which focuses more on Greek and Roman societies in the Mediterranean. CRM, or industrial archaeology, is a practice anytime you see a new road construction or a building going in. There are companies that bid for contracts to go in and investigate the area where construction will be taking place in order to ensure that any cultural remains that are there are identified, documented before the site or the feature itself is destroyed. There is also, surprisingly, underwater archaeology, and that's not something I know a whole lot about, although I have met a few people here and there in the field who are experts in this discipline. If you find it hard enough to dig a square hole, imagine doing it underground. Or, sorry, under the water. Excuse me. And then one of the more common designations you might already be aware of is the difference between prehistoric and historic archaeology. The timing when this cutoff occurs differs because it comes down to when we have known sources of historic documents or writing. That's what distinguishes the historic period from the prehistoric period, typically, although not always in all cases. So what do archaeologists study? Well, first and foremost, we study change over time and space. And you might hear me refer to this as temporal or spatial change. And the types of changes we're interested in looking at are biological change, cultural change, or maybe even a combination of both things. We search for evidence of our adaptive development as a species over time. Our methods of data collection involve identifying and recording sites, as well as systematic excavation and lab work. And the data that we collect inform our interpretations of human society and social processes. So without these data, we can't investigate things such as technology, economy, the social organization of different societies, their ideologies, and identities within those societies. This is a fun graphic that I like to bring up early on in the semester. It's the history of our Earth as depicted as a 24-hour clock. And what you should be seeing is if, we start 00000, formation of the Earth. Well, anatomically modern humans didn't come on the scene until 2 minutes before midnight. That is how much occurred on the planet before we as anatomical humans even came around. And even before that, we, as a history of our species, we only separated from our ape ancestors around 4.5 to 7 million years ago. In terms of some of the earliest material culture produced by humans, we find stone tools that date to about 3.3 million years ago in Kenya. And again, here you can see that depicted on this nice little timeline showing where we fall, and then, of course, the domain of archaeology itself. So that's when we see the earliest stone tools that were produced. That's the first form of material culture that can be studied. Before that, in order to look at our earliest hominid ancestors, we are in the realm of paleontology, and those are that's the fossil record of our ancestors. When I talk about material remains, what I mean are any kind of material that helps us to understand something about humans and their lives in the past. And in the two photos on the left, what you can see are the household assemblages of two homes in very different parts of the world. I believe it's Japan on the top part and a house in India on the bottom. You can see all of their worldly possessions on display in front of their house. This was a famous study from back in the day. And we can tell quite a lot by the actual material remains and material culture of these two different families. The archaeological record itself consists of the 5 things you see listed here, and we will talk about each of them in turn now. When we talk about artifacts, we're talking about anything that was created or modified by humans, and the most common materials that this tends to include are bone, stone, and pottery. You can see some nice bone tools that have been incised and are used maybe for sewing or other activities, a nice ceramic vessel, and then some stone objects, including projectile points, and then a pipe fragment up top. ECOFACTS are any material that provides information about the environments of the past. So this could include wooden artifacts, animal bones themselves. This is those that have not been modified then into some sort of artifact. Also botanical or pollen remains. So these are typically things that were used but not modified by humans. That's how we differentiate between artifacts and ECOFACTS. Features are the non-portable evidence of past human activity. Now this can include hearths, which you see up here, a nice cross-section of one. There are also burials themselves and structures. This is part of a pueblo that I helped to excavate in New Mexico. Human remains themselves are very important when it comes to archaeology. They can provide us with data regarding the gender, age, diet, health, occupation, cause of death, as well as the burial customs and beliefs of the society that that person belonged to. So in archaeological context, what do we mean by that? This is the spatial relationships among artifacts and their physical location in the ground. So you can see in the picture on the right, there's a grid system that's established with strings. So each square then has a known coordinate within a greater GPS system, and then you can tie in the location, the precise location of every artifact or feature that you find into that grid system. We'll get into this more in a couple weeks. Provenience then is a formal description of a context. So it's the measurements or the precise descriptions of where an artifact, or like you see in the left-hand photo, a particular bone is located within a burial. Archaeological sites can be defined in 2 ways. The first would be a behavioral definition, and by this we mean a place where human activity once took place. There is also the archaeological definition, which at a most basic level could be just a cluster of artifacts. Now what's important to keep in mind is that our archaeological interpretation is what moves us from artifacts back to the behavior that caused those artifacts to be in that place, to be in that certain position, in association with other features or structures, and we will see plenty of examples of this throughout the semester. Here are some examples of some pretty prominent archaeological sites here in the New World. Very obvious architecture, monumental architecture, some would call it, but also, the construction of more decorative sorts of displays on the Earth's surface as well. Sites can also be the collections of human remains, perhaps a bison kill site, which are massive collections of faunal remains. A site can also be just the stratigraphic relationships within an excavation unit. Sometimes sites are actually really hard to see. So in this upper left-hand photo, this is one of the earliest sites of anatomically modern humans, which doesn't look like much from the surface. But once you start walking around, looking more closely at what's on the surface, you might start to see some of these human remains popping up. Sometimes they are also located on the tops of very high peaks, and this provides great visibility for people coming towards the site from all around them. Rock art, as well as agricultural features, are also different types of sites. So what makes an archaeologist is not what they study, but how and why they are studying it. And this comes down to the questions that they ask, the methods they use to answer those questions, and ultimately the responsibility they feel about the fate of the material they unearth and the people who may have been affected. This brings us to the primary goals of archaeology. The first being to discover evidence of the past, and this involves a combination of fieldwork and lab analyses. We seek to reconstruct culture history. This involves describing, who was where, when, with what, and why. We try and interpret how people lived and what their societies were like in the past. And lastly, we explain changes in past cultures. So like I said, we're interested in looking at change over space and time. So some important questions that have been tackled are, how did we disperse around the globe so rapidly? The domestication of different plants and animal species. Also, why start living in villages and then eventually into even larger cities? And how was monumental architecture used within state societies? So these are some of the things we'll be discussing throughout the semester.